Catherine Branch, and I am the project consultant in the Government and Community Relations Department. I also serve on President Dorval Carter's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, the organization sponsoring today's Black History Month Fireside Chat with Valerie Jarrett. On behalf of the Diversity and Inclusion team, I am elated that so many of you could join us today. It is an honor to introduce Valerie Jarrett, a modern-day trailblazer who will share part of her story with us during her discussion with President Carter. Now, I had the privilege of working with and learning from this incredible woman for more than 25 years. During this time, she shared many of her valuable life lessons, helping guide me toward becoming the person I am today. In addition to being privileged enough to call her my boss, Ms. Jarrett has become a mentor, a friend, and ultimately a shero. I would not be standing here today if it wasn't for the powerful influence of such an extraordinary person in my life. She has truly helped me find my voice and continue to be an inspiration to so many women and men alike. Although Ms. Jarrett has accomplished enough throughout her career to fill various lifetimes, she is not done sharing her amazing talents with the world. In addition to her most well-known positions, serving as senior advisor to President Barack Obama, she was the first female chair of the Chicago Transit Authority Board. Yes, Ms. Jarrett has worn a variety of professional hats, both in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. Ms. Jarrett's professional background includes stints in both the public and private sectors. During her time at the White House, she oversaw the offices of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs, and she chaired the Council on Women and Girls. While in Chicago, she served as CEO of the Habitat Company, Deputy Chief of Staff for former Mayor Richard M. Daley, and as Commissioner of the Department of Planning and Development. Throughout her career, she has served on multiple corporate and nonprofit boards, providing her unique insight and expertise. Ms. Jarrett has also received countless awards and honorary degrees, including being named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. Now, last year, Ms. Jarrett released the New York Times best-selling book, Finding My Voice, My Journey to the West Wing and the Path Forward, which provides readers with an intimate view of her outstanding journey through stories of events that shaped her life path. And she became a new grandmother to a beautiful grandson. Ms. Jarrett and President Carter have known each other for many years and consider one another a real friend. President Carter considers Ms. Jarrett a true leader and credits her with inspiring his vision for a dynamic and vibrant Chicago Transit Authority system. All, please join me now as we warmly welcome to the stage Ms. Valerie Jarrett and President Dorval Carter.
Wow. Well, hello, everybody. If I'd known it was going to be like that, I'd have come back sooner. Thank you, Kathy Branch. You know I love you. I'm so proud of you. And good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Terry, the board members with whom I serve, Karen Disher, the new ones, and of course, Dorval. Hey there.
Thank you and welcome. For those of you who have heard me speak at my fireside chat, I've talked a lot about people who had a big impact on my career and the fact that you don't end up in positions like this without people who are helping you along the way. There's no question that Valerie is one of those people for me, and so when given the opportunity to ask her if she would do a fireside chat for us, she did not hesitate to come back and find time in her very busy schedule to sit down and to share with our employees sort of her experiences and sort of how that has impacted her life and, as just as importantly, I think the lives around her, the people who have been influenced by her work. And so I am both thrilled and probably a little bit nervous myself, which I've interviewed a lot of people, but this is sort of like, Terry Peterson and I were talking about this the other day. I asked Terry if he wanted to introduce Valerie for this event, and Terry told me, no, I'll get teary-eyed. I just can't do that. So I think that gives you some sense of the impact that someone like Valerie has had on all of us. And as I go through my questions, I think you'll get a better sense of sort of what she has been doing and what has driven her over the course of her career to be as successful as she is. Before I get started, I do want to give some introductions here of some people that we have in the room and acknowledge that their decision to come and support us on this event. One, of course, is CTA Chairman Terry Peterson. Current Board Director Kevin Irvine. Kevin, thank you for coming. As Valerie just mentioned, former Director Karen Disher. Karen. I also want to recognize the Department of Planning and Development Commissioner Maurice Cox. The Chicago Department of Aviation Deputy Commissioner Susan Curlin. Lester Barkley, the head of our Citizen Advisory Board. Lester. Angela Davis, the former chairman of the ADA Advisory Board. Melissa Fuller, the former vice chairman of the ADA Advisory Board. And Sylvia Garcia, my former chief of staff here at CTA. Great.
Dorable, before you begin, just point of information for those of you who don't know, Lester, that one of your predecessors who was chair of the Citizens Advisory Board was Michelle Obama.
I also have just been informed that the former commissioner of the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities, oh, there you are, Karen Tamley, the new head of the Director of Access Living is also with us. Karen, welcome. So, let's get started.
All right.
I want to start off initially with sort of talking to you about your life growing up here in Chicago. And I'm really interested in you explaining to the audience here sort of what your early life experiences are when you were growing up here, and how did those experiences sort of shape your career choices and impact your professional interests?
So I did grow up in Hyde Park, spent most of my childhood living there. But I have to tell you, I didn't really feel a part of the city politically when I was young. It didn't really connect to me. I don't even think I knew who my alderman was growing up. I certainly knew who the mayor was, and I knew you could lose an election if you didn't get the snow plowed. But I didn't really know a lot about politics, and certainly not about how the basic functions of the city worked. I took for granted, your basic city services, and never really thought much about it. And then Mayor Washington ran for office. And for many of you in this room who were old enough to remember his first campaign back in 1983, it was just magical. And it was the first time I thought, oh, he's actually talking to me. And I feel like I'm a part of this movement that led to something as unlikely as Harold Washington being elected. And he was just such a charismatic leader, a vocabulary like nothing you've ever heard. He never used a word with fewer than 3 syllables, and they were all actually words. I mean, he was smart as a whip, and he understood politics, and he understood public service, and he was a committed public servant and a very astute politician. And when he was reelected to his second term, I was wallowing away in the private practice of law at a very big fancy law firm, and I thought I was doing everything I was supposed to do. My parents were very proud of me. I had a fancy office with a view of Lake Michigan, and I would sit in that office and just cry. I was just so miserable. I felt totally unfulfilled, and I had a baby a year and a half earlier, and I just felt she will never be proud of me if I continue doing this work, even though it was what everyone else kind of thought I should be doing. And so a good friend of mine, who several of you know, Elvin Charity, had worked for Mayor Washington for 2 years in his first term, and was heading back to his law firm. And he said, Valerie, why don't you consider public service? You'll feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself, more important than yourself. A city that you love, you can give back to. And there was just something about being miserable and that inspirational message that drove me to take this leap of faith. And I remember walking out of that fancy office and into City Hall the first day, and I was so excited because I was in the lobby. I was passing people who I had read about it in the newspaper, and it was like celebrity sightings. And I go up to the 5th floor, and when you get off on the 5th floor, it says Office of the Mayor. And I thought, I can't believe my office is on the same floor as the mayor. And I go down the hall, and Susan Curlin, who's here, she and I started within weeks of each other. And I walked in, and my boss met me out at reception. He said, let me take you to your office. And he did air quotes. It's never a good sign. Never a good sign. And he takes me to the bowels of the agency, to a cubicle with a window, not looking at Lake Michigan, but facing the alley next door. And he must have seen this look on my face, and he goes, you don't understand. Windows are hard to get around here. So I was like, okay, all right. But from that moment, I just felt like I was where I belonged. And I learned so much in local public service. And I know Terry would remember this from his days in the 17th Ward, where I first met him, where he was Chief of Staff to Alderman then Streeter. You learn how to take diverse opinions on the ground. You have to learn to listen. You have to understand that when you go to the grocery store, you are fair game. Everybody knows where you live. They have your phone number. And it is a 24/7 exercise, and that's as it should be, because that's what public service is all about. It's in service of the public. And I think those experiences that I had working in city government and at the CTA taught me so much that was invaluable throughout the rest of my life. And I'm just glad I had the courage to stop doing what everybody thought I should be doing and do what the quiet voice inside of me told me I would feel passionately about doing.
You know, it's interesting, your comment about having the courage to do that. I know a lot of people, you know, think about taking that jump, you know, believing in pursuing a different path and so on and so forth. You're one of the people who actually did it. And, you know, at the time that you were sort of, you know, making that decision, was there some trepidation or, you know, thoughts about, am I crazy? I know how much money you were making in the private sector, and clearly you were not going to be making that kind of money in the public sector, and you know, yet you made that choice to move forward anyway. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There was a lot of blowback. In fact, for reasons I cannot explain, my mother drove me to work my first day at City Hall. Why was she driving me to work? I was a grown woman, married with a child. Maybe it was just so she could say to me as I was getting out of the car, I can't believe I spent all that money on tuition for you to be working at City Hall. And so, yeah, there were a lot of people who looked at me like I was crazy. But I think, well, first of all, I knew that if it didn't work out, and Elvin said this to me, he said, look, 6 months, if you don't like it, you could always go to a big law firm. So I had a safety net. And a lot of people can't take chances, and I'm very mindful of that. But I also knew that if I continued doing what I was doing, it was not going to be a purposeful life. And I just wanted to do something where I felt like I was purposeful. And I did think, well, if it doesn't work out in 6 months, I'll leave. And 8 years later, and 3 jobs later, I left. And so, but I don't want to underestimate how hard it is to listen to that quiet voice. But it should be an adventure. When I say it, I mean life. It should be an adventure. And you are the only one that can kind of reinvent yourself and decide, this is not the path for me. It is not fulfilling. I could do more. And you do have to stretch yourself. I mean, I always talk about Kathy, and my goodness, the entire time we've known each other, which is now, I think, 28 years, she's always been reinventing herself and going back to school and looking for new opportunities and asking for new responsibilities. And I think that's the role model we should all follow.
No, I agree. Thank you. So, you obviously had a very successful career over at City Hall and filled a number of important positions during your tenure there. But eventually, you made a decision it was time to move on. You left, you know, City Hall, and you went into the private sector, went to work for the Habitat Company, And you also took on what I believe the mayor described to you as an easy lift kind of a job, chairman of the CTA. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you got talked into taking on that job?
So that was probably not one of the more honest things he said to me. Because I remember my first briefing and I said yes because I was leaving the Department of Planning and Development, a job I loved. And so I was having very mixed feelings about leaving public service. The good thing about the Habitat Company is that they were the receiver for the Chicago Housing Authority, and a lot of the work that I had done in the planning department was redeveloping, working with the Housing Authority and the Habitat Company to redevelop these large tracts of public housing land. And so I knew I was going to get to continue to do what I loved so much. But Mayor Daley was like, well, I think you should do this because then you're still associated with me, and it's like there are meetings once a month, and you just go to the meeting, and it's a pretty easy lift. And I was like, okay, I trust you. And then I came over, we were at the Merchandise Mart, so I went to my first briefing with Bob Belcaster, who was the president of the CTA, and he said, I just want to let you know that we're exploring the legal options of bankruptcy for the CTA. I was like, say what? Are you kidding me? I thought this was an easy lift. What you talking about, fella? So no, it didn't turn out to be easy, but it did turn out to teach me again a lot about, start talking about affecting people's ways that they get to and from work and to and from shopping and to and from people that they love. You are right next to housing. That is the most proximate that you get. And people have very strong feelings about their public transit. And we were broke at a time when we needed a lot of infusion of capital. And we were burning through our capital in our operating budget. And we were getting less money from the federal government. In fact, they zeroed out our operating budget while I was here. So we had this just challenge of trying to continue to provide that basic service while we were still trying to provide, fiscal solvency. So, yeah, it wasn't as easy as Mayor Daley said. I reminded him of that quite frequently.
Well, you know, one of the stories that I've heard about you, and it's always interesting because you do get a chance, and Valerie's paths and my paths have crossed numerous times over the course of our careers. But I heard a story about you the other day that I'd never heard before about you riding CTA. And
talking to Greg?
Yes. So apparently when you were about to be announced as chairman, Greg basically said, well, you got to get some CTA tokens. And Greg went out and got you. At that point in time, we didn't have a venture card. Basically, you paid with a little token that looks like a CTA medallion to ride the system. And so Greg got you a bunch of CTA tokens. And then there's a conversation about when was the last time you had ridden CTA. And I understand that you have made the point that when you were pregnant, that you had gotten on a bus.
Jeffrey Express, number 6.
And
nobody would get up for me.
Right.
I was like 8 months pregnant. I was done. And I would look at, people like trying to catch their eye, and I'm like, and I gained like 80 pounds, so there was no mistaking in the hot summer. Oh, I was mad.
Well, I want to take this opportunity because you weren't the only pregnant mother who's felt that way about CTA. And that one of the things that we did as an agency is we created a campaign called Baby on Board. And we have a button I want to give to you that basically we would have given to you had I been here then.
So I wouldn't have had to say anything. I could just...
Yes, exactly right.
People would avert their eyes. They knew better. Oh, my God. I love this. This is a great idea.
So, one of the ways that we're trying to make it a little bit easier for expectant mothers going forward. And I apologize if we weren't in a position to do that when you were here, but you certainly, over your time as chairman of CTA, had a tremendous impact on this organization. And having worked with you on a number of initiatives and programs and things of that nature during your time here as chairman, I was wondering if you could share with us what you felt was one of the most important initiatives or projects that you sort of championed while you were here as chairman of the agency.
I think in focusing on capital improvements, I remember the red line, the green line, the yellow line. We put money just about in every line you could think of. We bought new buses. We experimented with new sorts of fuel efficiency buses. And I think ensuring, because what you end up doing is, you do this probably with your own car too, right? You put off the maintenance that you know you should do, because there's always something more important to spend with your money. But making that a priority and going to Washington and lobbying for those important dollars so that we could restore both the bus and we had those old buses. And they were always breaking down on Lakeshore Drive, and I was
Yes.
always like trying to call and find out why are we breaking down and we're taking up 2 lanes of traffic and everybody's mad at us.
And you would call me.
I would call Doorbell. I would call Doorbell. Because I really knew the people on that side were, and it was just such a terrible image for the CTA. And the
Yes.
buses were breaking down all the time. So between the trains and the buses, really infusing that important capital and trying to develop a stronger working relationship with the RTA, which we needed in order to get approval of our budget. And someone was reminding me earlier, that first year, it was really, Tom McCracken, who was chairman of the RTA, we were locked in a room for weeks just trying to get our budget approved. And it was difficult, but again, it taught me that just because they're Republicans doesn't mean we don't have to work with them. We do. And we needed their support and cooperation, and we were able to get a lot done through that effort.
I can imagine some of that also paid dividends for you when you went to D.C.
Yes. Although I do say one thing about DC, and it's why working at the local level in Doraville, I know you'll appreciate this, Susan too, that those of us who have worked at both levels, is that sometimes people in Washington are just too far removed from the lives of the people that they are impacting with their decisions. And so I think those early experiences on the ground here, both in the city and at the CTA, I tried to keep those stories with me when I was making decisions where there are a lot more zeros after the numbers, but the impact is still on individual people.
I can tell you, yes. No, go ahead and clap for that. Absolutely right. I can tell you that one of the other things that I could never figure out about you, Valerie, when you were chairman of CTA, is how you kept your desk immaculate.
Well, did you ever see Beth White or Greg's desk?
Yes. Yes, I did, actually.
So my thought was, let's get it off my desk and onto theirs. And I learned that back in the planning department. I learned a lot from Greg in the planning department. In fact, I should tell you all, because you all know Greg, but Greg I inherited when I became the Commissioner of Planning and Development, and I sent word to him, I'm sure I didn't tell him directly, that I was going to fire him. Because I couldn't imagine any reason why I would ever want to talk to the press or do any public speaking, and that was what he was doing. And he sent word back, well, why don't you give it a couple weeks and see how you feel? Well, needless to say, he became an indispensable part of my life, both there and here. But I did learn how to be efficient and just keep things moving, knowing that when I handed them off to Beth or to Greg or to any of our other folks on the team, that it would be taken care of, and taken care of in a way that would treat people decently.
Well, and you're raising a point that I think is really important for the employees to hear, which is you don't do this by yourself.
No, goodness no.
And one of the challenges of being a leader is developing a really good team to support you. And you certainly had a terrific team. Obviously, I worked with both Beth and Greg. Still work with Greg. And talk a little bit about sort of becoming a leader in the public sector, and sort of how one sort of gets in that role, and sort of what do you see as the challenges about being a leader?
Well, I would say maybe the Commissioner of Planning and Development is where I really started recognizing that I had an agency that was counting on me. When you're practicing law, you're really an advisor, and somebody else is the decision maker. They can take your advice or not, but when you're the Commissioner of Planning and Development and you're overseeing a large team, people are looking to you, and I was not an urban planner. I was a lawyer, and so I knew that my senior people knew a lot more than I did. I knew Greg and Marla and Marcel and people who had masters in urban planning. Greg was teaching urban planning, and so I learned to listen, and I think part of leadership starts with knowing what you don't know and listening to the people and recruiting people. You are only as good as your weakest link. And I spent a lot of time recruiting the best and brightest people who knew a lot more than I did, and who I knew not just substantively were smart and worked hard and were committed to this for the right reason, but also that they had a moral compass, and I wouldn't have to worry about them getting into any kind of ethical or moral dilemma. Because because it would embarrass the mayor and it would embarrass me. And so I have a pretty good eye for talent. I think my best hire was Michelle Van Robinson, but I take a lot of
Maybe.
credit for that one. Nearly 30 years ago, 1991.
Wow.
But I spent a lot of time really trying to surround myself with people who shared my commitment to the city and this region, but also just had expertise that I didn't have, and then learning to rely on them, and then also trying to get them to support one another. I mean, we spent a lot of time together. I know even though when Terry was in the department and Greg was in the department, they also developed their own relationship with each other, so that by the time they came to me with a recommendation, they had been through a process where they had teased out the idea, because as a leader, your time is very precious, and you want to make sure that your team, when you're not in the room, is gelling and working together and developing relationships without you having to be the one to forge them. So a lot goes into leadership, and some of it is also accepting the fact that you ultimately sometimes have to choose between a bad decision and an even worse decision, but you do have to make a decision. You know, you can't just be paralyzed out of fear or because it might be wrong. You just kind of got to go with it. If it's wrong, you learn from your mistake and you keep going, but you do have to drive the decision-making process forward.
Well, you know, you mentioned as part of your leadership, strategy, developing a team and working with that team and trusting that team, and obviously giving them the bandwidth to, go out there and prove themselves. Obviously, another portion of that is mentoring. And you have a pretty stellar record of superstars that you have mentored over the course of your career, one of which is sitting right here, and he doesn't miss an opportunity to remind me of that, Terry Peterson, the chairman of our board. Can you talk a little bit about the mentoring aspect of being a leader and sort of how you weave that into the work that you do, and how important is that to you to handle mentorship?
Well, let's start with the fact that I was very well mentored. When I landed in City Hall, pretty kind of broken in spirit, I think, after the experience at the law firm, and I was in the middle of a divorce, and so I was pretty miserable. And there was a woman who worked in the mayor's office who oversaw finance and development in the mayor's office, and I became her lawyer for finance and development in the law department. Her name was Lucille Dobbins, and Lucille was such a good role model because she took me under her wing. And as a lawyer, at a law firm, you're used to being like way outside the decision-making process, and once the business people make a decision, they just give it to you to document. And Lucille brought me in, she brought me to policy meetings, she brought me to meetings with the mayor, she let me make presentations, and then professionally, she was kind of scary, I have to tell you. And I worked with her really closely, and I knew she liked me, but I was still a little scared of her. And I finally reached the point where my daughter was old enough to talk, and she would say, "Come home," because that's what kids do when you're at work. And I said to Lucille, "Look, I got to go home at, say, 6. I'll come back, but I got to go home for a couple hours, spend some time with Laura, and then I'll, come back to work." And she said, "Well, I live south. How about I just stop at your house, and when Laura goes to bed, we'll work from there." Well, who does that, right? Now, I did start making dinner, so she got dinner out of it. But it was just so incredibly thoughtful. But part of the reason I share that with you is that I told Lucille what was going on. And I think sometimes we're so busy, like when I was at the law firm, I compartmentalized, and I was in a big conference room when I was like at 2 in the morning once, and I kept getting up to go do stuff. I said, well, I was 8.5 months pregnant. I was going to the bathroom, because that's what you do when you're 8.5 months pregnant. But I didn't want anybody to know that. Now, I'd already told you I gained a lot of weight. They knew I was pregnant, but I was so busy thinking that they would think I was less committed to my job if I opened up and told them what was going on in my life. And so one of my bits of advice to you guys is that you have to open up to people who are around you. They won't know what your needs are unless you tell them. They will just have no idea. Karen was talking to us earlier about the ADA and just the simple ways in which, and not even that expensive ways in which it made the lives of people with disabilities easier. But the people who were making those decisions before had no idea. And so you have to be willing to open up and say, this is what I need in order to thrive here. And you should do that in the interviewing process if you can, which is what Michelle Robinson did to me. She put me on my heels because I didn't have answers to all her questions, but she wanted to really make sure she knew what she was getting into. So I opened up with Lucille, and she even got me to ask for a promotion, which I would never, I don't know how many of you all have asked for promotions, but at that point in my career, it would never have occurred to me to go in to my boss, let alone my boss's boss, which is what she wanted me to do, and ask for a promotion. And she kept pushing me and pushing me and pushing me to do it. Finally, I did it just so she'd stop hassling me about it. I was scared to death. I don't know, what was it going to kill me or something? No. And Lucille said, worst thing he'll say is no. And then you'll ask him why, and then 6 months later, go in and ask for it again. And I went in and I made this big presentation about why I should be my boss's boss. Not just a promotion, but that my boss should report to me, which I thought was just nuts, right? And he listened to me very quietly, and then he said, okay. And I was like, oh, that's great. So fast forward 30 years, I write my book, and I call everybody who's in it to tell them what I say about them. I don't want anybody to be surprised. So I call Lucille, and I said, I want you to know I say all these things about you in the book, how wonderful you were, how much supportive you were, you changed my life, how you got me to go ask for that promotion. But I said, but I gave the book to someone to read, and they thought that that promotion kind of came kind of easy. I said, did you say anything to him before I went in there? And she said, I might have. For 30 years, I thought I went in there and made this compelling case for why I deserved that promotion. But that's the difference between a mentor who kind of pulls you aside and says, this is what you should do, or this, and coaches you, and an advocate who goes to bat for you when you're not in the room. And I will say I paid it forward, because I said to Susan Curlin, hey, Susan, I just got a promotion. You should go ask for one, too. And she's like, no, I couldn't do that. And I think, I helped push her the same way Lucille had pushed me. And so because I had such a wonderful mentor and advocate, and I think she was proud, she's still proud of what I've done, I thought, well, I want to do that for the people on my team and the people in my life. And because I was such a pitiful young person and I needed all that help, I realized that just with a little effort, you can change somebody's life as she did mine.
What a wonderful story. Every time we talk, I learn new stuff about you. I'm just like, wow.
We're all like that. It's like peeling an onion.
Yeah, you're right.
The more open you become about crazy stuff.
So let's fast forward a little bit. I remember the first time you introduced me to President Obama. And it was down in Springfield. It was at the Taste of Chicago event. And you walked up with him and said, I want you to meet somebody who I think is really going to be doing something special. I had no idea at the time that I was meeting the future president of the United States. But I remember thinking at the time, because I had met a lot of elected officials and dealt with a lot of politicians, I remember thinking about how humble he seemed, in spite of the fact that he was an elected official at that time, and that he really comes across as sincere. He doesn't seem like he's trying to put on, some sort of attitude or something like that, which is usually what I see when I'm doing this. Clearly, you saw something wonderful in him, which ultimately led to a journey that took you to Washington, D.C. and to the White House. Now, I remember the first time that I went into the actual White House, not the Eisenhower building, which everyone says is like going to the White House, but it really isn't like going to the White House. It's going to the building next to the White House. But the first time that I actually went into the White House, and I was sitting in the Roosevelt room, and we were having a meeting, and about halfway through the meeting, I stopped and said to myself, wait a minute, I am in the frickin' White House, in the Roosevelt room. Yes, and I remember thinking, my parents would have never, ever imagined that I would be here. And so my question, after my long story about myself, talk to me about your experience when you finally got there and sort of what impact it had on you. Because I know what impact it had on me, and I'll never forget it for the rest of my life.
Well, the first time I went into the White House after President Obama had been elected was right before the inauguration. And I will say this, that President Bush, with whom we disagreed about almost every possible policy, he and his team were unbelievably supportive during the transition. And my predecessor invited me to come to the White House and talk to him about the Offices of Intergovernmental Affairs and Public Engagement, they called it Public Liaison back then, and how he'd set it up and the challenges and opportunities. And everyone in the Bush administration had been directed by President Bush to do the same. So there was a sense, I think, that politics is one thing and you fight a campaign, and when the campaign is over, smooth and orderly transitions are part of the underlying basis of a strong democracy. So our first time going into the White House, I went with my soon-to-be Chief of Staff, Mike Strautmanis. Some of you might know, he's working, I know you know him well, he's working for the Obama Foundation here. And so we went in together to meet my predecessor, and we go through the security, and shows you a little bit about my paranoia. I start thinking about, do I have any outstanding parking tickets? Am I gonna get through here okay? You just don't know what's in your background that the Secret Service might have, right? So we get through the gates, and it's dusk, and it's November, and so it gets dark early, and they had just lit up the White House. It was a beautiful white as the sun is going down. And off to the right-hand side is something called Pebble Beach. It's where all the press hang out. You've seen the photos 1,000 times where reporters or people from the White House are talking with the White House as the backdrop. And they were folding up the camera crews for the day. And one of the cameramen yelled out to Mike and to me, must have recognized us, and said, "Hey, welcome to the White House." And we looked at each other, and we burst into tears. And we just stood on that driveway, like uncontrollably crying. Now, we were exhausted, and all the other emotions I can give you as an excuse for why we burst into tears. But just the awesome fact that we were going into a place that we would one day work was crazy. I never in my wildest dreams thought I would work there, let alone for somebody who I had known for so long and respected so much. So, and every day I would pinch myself. Every single day. I could not believe I was going in there to serve this country from that place. And it is a very special place.
Yes, it is. And the one comment I will make about the White House, I did get a chance when I was interviewing to be Chief of Staff to the Secretary. I had to come see Broderick, the Cabinet Affairs person. And that was the first time I'd actually been up in the office portion of the White House. Their offices are small. Really, really small. Yeah, you're right. It was about the size of this stage right here, and I was like, wow.
I'll tell you one office that's not small.
Yes.
The Oval Office. I'll tell you one quick story, because Kathy's here. It's a great story. So the first week, well, first of all, when I tell Kathy I'm going, I was trying to get up the nerve to say, will you leave Chicago and uproot yourself and move to Washington? And I got out like, would you? And she goes, yes, when are we going? So we go there, and our first week, we are unpacking boxes and trying to figure out where everything is, and it's late on Friday night. I mean, not that late, it's like 5:30 on a Friday night, and Tina Chen, who I had recruited from Chicago to come and work there, her office was next door to mine. And so Tina and Kathy and I are in my office, and we're talking, and suddenly we look up in the doorway, and there's President Obama. He's like wandering around the White House. And so we're like, what are you doing here? He said, I just want to see where everybody is and what's going on. And he said to Kathy and to Tina, have you seen the Oval Office yet? And they said, no. And now my first time in there was his first full day in the office, and all I did was like look up, because the ceiling is really pretty. And you don't see the ceiling on TV that much, right? So I was like in the meeting like this, and he's like, Valerie, I'm like, yeah, okay. So we go down to the Oval Office, and just as we get there, who shows up but Michelle Obama. And so Tina, Kathy, Michelle, and President Obama, we sit down on the couches to talk. And it was, if you imagine, you've known these people for so long, and Kathy's known them as long as I have, Tina's known them as long as I have, but he's now the President of the United States, and we're at the Oval Office. So we were chatting for a good while, and then finally he says to us, well, I guess I better get back to work. And so we jump up, except Michelle Obama does not jump up. She says, well, I'm not ready yet. And so we sit back. So that just gives you a sense as to like the natural order of things.
Well, I do want to make one other real quick comment, and then we're going to open it up for you to answer some questions from the employees. When I gave my fireside chat, I talked a lot about the people who had mentored me over the course of my career. What I don't think is I never told the story of the conversation I had with Valerie when I was going to be considered to be chief of staff. And at the time, the Secretary of Transportation, Anthony Foxx, was trying to figure out who he knew in the White House who could be an advocate for allowing me to become chief of staff. Because you have to understand, there's a hierarchy by which these positions get filled. And I wasn't going through the typical hierarchy. He had literally plucked me out of an agency within his department and said, I want to put you in basically what's viewed as one of the top positions in the department. And nobody in the White House knew who I was. I mean, I wasn't a political appointee, but as you can imagine, there are thousands of political appointees, and the White House doesn't know any of them. And so I'm sitting in his office, and he's talking about who he knows at the White House, and he's running through names, and he finally mentions Valerie Jarrett. He says, do you happen to know Valerie Jarrett? You know, she's from Chicago. And I said, oh, no, I know Valerie very well. I used to work for her. And he was like, perfect. I need for you to call Valerie and tell Valerie that I'm looking to have you become my chief of staff. So I don't think I had had any lengthy conversation with you since I'd been in the administration. We had seen each other at events, stuff like that. So I call her up, I talk to Catherine. Catherine puts me in contact with Valerie. Valerie proceeds to tell me what a wonderful opportunity this is going to be for me to work with Anthony, and that he's a terrific person, and I think you're going to absolutely enjoy being chief of staff, and of course, I'll make sure that, that you're supported for that position. Valerie is the reason, I will say one of the reasons, that I got that opportunity. And if it weren't for that opportunity, I probably would be sitting here as president of the CTA. So she is my mentor directly for that.
I thank you for that, Dorval, but I might add that you didn't stay long as chief of staff. You ditched us to come back home. But he knew the one place he could say he was going was back to my old home. So
right. It was the only job that I could take other than that one.
That's true.
So with that, what I'd like to do is open up the opportunity for you to answer a few questions. But before I do that, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the book that you wrote, Finding My Voice, My Journey to the West Wing and the Path Forward by Valerie Jarrett, for all of you to see. I can tell you it's a wonderful read, and it's a terrific telling of your life story. Some of which I knew, many of which I didn't, particularly with your family and sort of relationships that you had with your father and your grandparents growing up. So thank you for giving a piece of yourself in a book for all of us to enjoy.
Thank you very much, Dorval. So we solicited questions from all of you, and I think I got 19 questions. So I'm not going to have time to answer all 19. I have read all 19, and they're really good. And I might try to consolidate some of them together with the answers. So here we go. So what was your fondest memory of your tenure at the CTA? And what do you remember most from your time at the White House? So this might surprise those of you who know me well, but one day I was doing jury duty. Why was I doing jury duty? Because you're supposed to do jury duty when you get called, right? So I go over to the Daly Center, and then I get picked to go through the voir dire to be picked for a jury. Now, I didn't think that would happen. I thought that would get, kicked out before it came to that. So I'm sitting in the box, and my beeper, we had beepers back then, goes off. And the judge was like, not very nice. And so he's staring, and I'm like trying to fight the beeper. So they give us a break, and it says 911-3300. Well, that's Mayor Daley's line. So I call, and Rose, his assistant, says, Mayor Daley would like to see you. There has been a derailment of the blue line going out to the airport because it was snowing so badly. So I said, well, I'm in jury duty. And she said, Valerie, Mayor Daley said, get over here right away. So I'm like a deer in the headlights. So I go wandering back into the chambers. What was I thinking? Like, looking for this judge. Well, jurors are not supposed to talk to judges, right? So I run into him. He's looking at me, and I said, sir, I'm on the jury. He said, stop. You may not talk to me. I said, I have to go. And he's like, where do you have to go? I said, train derailed, blue line, chair of the board, gotta go, Mayor Daley wants me. He goes, you may not leave. I said, sir, I gotta go. So that's the funny part of the story. So I go back, I talk to Mayor Daley. He said, I want you to get on this right away, obviously get on this right away. And then he said, what took you so long? I said, well, I was in jury duty, and the judge was like haggling me. He goes, what was the judge's name? So it office, he was like, Rose, get so-and-so on the phone. Not the judge, the chief judge is who he was calling to complain about the judge. But that's not the reason why it's my favorite day. But it's funny. The reason why it's my favorite day is that night, late at night, as we were trying to fix this system, I went around to one of the rail yards where they were working on the trains, just to thank the people who were working at the CTA. And I started talking to them about what they were doing in their job, and here it's like 2 in the morning. And the commitment to service and professionalism, their desire to make sure that our trains were all prepared for this ridiculous weather we were having, that we straightened out the mess on the blue line, it just made me realize how important it is that we put a spotlight on those people who do not get the spotlight that they deserve. And I will never forget that night.
I
Cold
agree.
out there.
Yes.
It was cold, but it was a good night. All right, so I'm going to come back to the White House. So I often get this question, and there are a couple of these on like work-life balance and how do you have these positions of leadership and et cetera. And I've decided of late, like, you know, this notion of can you have it all? Well, I think that's totally unrealistic, and we should stop talking about having it all. I think the better question, and this is perhaps directed more to the women in the room because we still disproportionately shoulder many of the responsibilities outside of work, although it's getting better generationally. But I think the better question is, when you look back, did you have a whole life? Like, did you love? Were you well loved? Did you make room and space for your friends and your family, not on a 50-50 basis? I don't know a relationship that's ever 50-50, but did you do enough to replenish yourself? So, for example, in the White House, I had a group of good friends and one relative who I'd known forever, and Susan Curlin was one of them, and every Sunday we would have brunch, and we almost never talked about work. We just were able to relax and catch our breath. And I would look forward to it all week long, and it was enough to like get me through to the next week. And the hours were ridiculous, but if you could just have like that 2 hours once a week, well, that's not balance, but it is replenishing. And I think part of the challenge is the structural and cultural impediments that keep us all from having those whole lives. And I used to think when, well, how many of you parents? And how many of you have children, let's say, under 10? Under 5? All right, so this will resonate with you. But when I was young, I used to think, well, if I was just smarter, if I were more efficient, if I were better organized, if I slept fewer hours, maybe this wouldn't be so hard trying to, particularly being a single mom. But I was a single mom with a good paying job, with health insurance, with a consistent sitter who was with me from the time Laura was 3 months old until we packed her off to college. Parents lived a mile away. My dad took Laura to school, picked her up every day. I had the best safety net you could imagine, and I still felt like I was holding on by my fingertips. And so I used to think, well, what about those working families that have none of that, who are one paycheck away from not being able to pay the rent, or not being able to put food on the table, or foregoing health care because they don't have health insurance. And I started thinking about what are those structural impediments that keep us from being whole, and what are the cultural ones that keep women and people of color from not advancing the way they have the right to advance and have earned so much. And so that's really what kind of got me into the work that I did in Washington, was to try to level that playing field and make it a little fairer. And, you know, we should raise the minimum wage. We haven't raised the minimum wage in this country in 10 years, the federal minimum wage. It's ridiculous. We should have paid leave. We're the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a national paid leave policy. We have children. We have older parents. We have responsibilities outside of work. And employers that get that, and increasingly the good news is they are, have a more productive workforce, a more efficient workforce, and in the private sector more profitable, and in the public sector more loyal. And, you know, we shouldn't be having to worry about being sexually harassed when we go to work. I mean, there's some basic things that we should count on. So this whole notion of having it all, I look at it more like, what can we do to make the transition between work and home more honest? and more fluid? And how can we empower people to, I always tell the story about Mayor Daley, since I'm in Chicago, it will relate to you, because if you didn't know him, you knew of him. So he was like Lucille, only even more scary. And I was in his office once with Susan Schur, who was the corporation counsel, went on to be Mrs. Obama's chief of staff. And we were in this meeting, and we're both looking at our watches, and he's looking at us like, why are you looking at your watches? And he finally says, why are you looking at your watches? And I don't know what I would have said if Susan hadn't been in the room. I think about this often. But somehow she gave me courage to say, well, sir, the Halloween parade starts in 20 minutes, and we're 25 minutes away. And you know what he said? He said, then what are you doing here? Go. And we flew down Lakeshore Drive. We get to our kids' school. We were both in second grade together. And just as they open the doors of the school, these little darlings come out in their costumes, and they're looking through the audience just like this for us, and we were there. Why? Because he valued the fact that we were single moms, but also because I had the courage to say to him, this is what is going on in my life. And many times we're not in a position where we can speak up, but if you can speak up, you should do that, because you have to fight to be the parent you want to be. Nobody's going to make that easy on you. You have to just fight for it and say, this is what I need. You know that?
Oh, I do. Yeah.
Right. And it's not that they're being mean, it's just they don't know.
Right.
Unless you enlighten them. And I think you won't enlighten them unless you trust them. And so part of how you develop this bond of trust is to tell your story and be honest with people and ask them to open up and talk, because everything is about relationships. You're here because of a relationship. I'm here because Kathy asked me. There's nothing I wouldn't do that Kathy asked me to do. I mean, we're all a part of this kind of broader network of relationships, but it takes hard work. And I think in the end, what you want to be defined by is not like what title you had, but the impacts you had on people. I'm doing the questions.
Yes, you're doing the questions.
I know,
You're looking at me like, okay, what's the next question? I'm like, I don't have a question. I'm sitting here in awe like everybody else listening to the answers.
All right, I'm going to say this one for last. It's a good one. We answered this one already.
I'm being told
This is a
you
good
got,
one, huh?
we have time for 2 more.
Okay, all right, let me, oh man, there's so many good ones. All right, this is a good one. What are the keys to developing the next generation of world leaders? Starting by appealing to people's civic responsibility. And I think sometimes people look at the challenges that we have around the world and look, they're big, they are huge. But the solutions start very local, in your own community, on your own block, in your own house of worship, in your own community organization. And I think that if you start local, and I'm totally biased because I started in public service local, you begin to learn the lessons that are building blocks towards the future. And one of the many things I'm doing right now is helping President Obama with his foundation, and it is a laboratory to teach civic engagement. And one of the other things I'm doing with Mrs. Obama is we started an organization called When We All Vote. I hope everybody in this room is registered to vote. And it was important to both of us that it be nonpartisan, because our country will be better if everybody's voting. If everybody has skin in the game, and an informed voter, not like who's cute or who has a, just like find out, do they share your values? Do they reflect your priorities? Do they have a track record that will help, lead our city, our county, our country in a better direction? And I think that takes practice. And it's hard work, and people get busy, and they have children, and they don't want to go to a community meeting. And I used to joke, and I'm sure you're going to see this, a lot of the people who show up at the community meeting are either really, really mad because they don't like what you're going to do, or they're really, really not wrapped too tight. Greg, am I right? And your job is to listen to all of them and embrace them and tease out the best in them, right? And that's really hard to do. And I think, but that's the challenge. And I think too many people say, what difference does it make? It makes all the difference in the world. It's worth it. Tutor one child. Mentor one person in your team. Ask them what's going on when you know they have a sick parent. Find out what's happening in their life. Just try to make their lives a little bit better. All right, one last question you said?
Yes.
All right. Well, this is an easy one. It won't be my last one, but How does it feel to be a grandmother? Oh, the best job ever. All right. I guess this is what was the most memorable moment you had serving President Obama? Well, as I said, every single day I pinch myself, every single day. I think the most extraordinary day was a day in June of 2015, right at the end of the Supreme Court term. And the lawyers in the room will know everybody tries to predict what the Supreme Court will do, but also when they will do it. And they put all the controversial stuff at the end of their term in June. And the day before this day, the Supreme Court had ruled in favor for the second time upholding the Affordable Care Act. Why it had to go to the Supreme Court twice escapes me, but it did. And so we figured, okay, well, they're not going to do anything else on a Friday. They'll probably wait until the last week. And so I'm sitting in the Chief of Staff's office, Dennis McDonough at the time, and my assistant, not Kathy, Kathy had left by, no, what? Why was it? It was Huma. Well, you were there, but why? Well, for some reason, Huma came down, not Kathy. Was it Alexa? All right. See, I have a fact checker over here. You sure it wasn't Huma? All right, probably it was Alexa. Comes down with a note, and it says, marriage equality was decided today by the Supreme Court, 5-4. We won. So I scream out to everybody in the room, and Dennis said, you should go tell President Obama, because my team had been working on all the LGBTQ issues from the very beginning, from repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to DOMA, to you name it. And so I run down to the Oval Office, and guess what? He is not there, right? It's 10:10 in the morning. He should be there, right? So I'm very upset. So I go back to Dennis's office, and he goes, what did he say? And I said, he wasn't there. And he said, well, did you call him? I was like, I guess I could pick up the phone. It's pretty important, right? So Dennis's assistant hears this conversation, so she dials the White House operator, gets him on the phone, and so when I pick up the phone, and he goes, what? What? That's not how we speak to one another. And it threw me off, honestly. It threw me off a little bit. So I got a little defensive, and I said, well, sir, I was calling to tell you that the marriage equality decision came down today 5-4. And there's a long, pregnant pause, and he goes, and who won? I was like, darn it, I forgot the whole point of the phone call. So I said, we won. And he said, oh, it's been a great week, thinking of the Affordable Care the day before. He says, I'll be right down. I'm finishing up the eulogy for Reverend Pinckney and the 8 parishioners who had been murdered in Charleston. And so I thought, oh, well, that's why you're late coming down, because you're working on that. And let me tell you, there was so much gun violence around our country, and he became the consoler-in-chief. And it was just so unbelievably frustrating to see an issue where 90% of the American people agreed on a simple step we could take. It wouldn't necessarily end all gun violence, but it would help. And we often talk about Sandy Hook being just incredible, that somebody at such a young age could kill 20 kids, 1 first grade kids, and 6 adults. But then 3 weeks later, I came home with Mrs. Obama for the funeral of Hadia Pendleton, who was murdered, a mile from the block where we live in Chicago. And that was devastating. And so he had really struggled with, what on earth am I going to say in this speech that will be any different than all these other times where I've had to speak about gun violence. So he comes down, and if you can imagine the setting in his office, he's trying to finish the eulogy. Now he's got to write a speech about marriage equality. They're outside in the Rose Garden putting together a stage, because every time the president speaks, they build a new stage and they take it down, so it looks like a Rose Garden again. They build a new stage and they take it down. So there's chaos. I'm trying to get the plaintiffs on the phone so we can congratulate them on the decision. And normally, when the president speaks in the Rose Garden, staff are not supposed to come. You're supposed to be working, right? You're in the White House, you should be working, unless you were directly involved in the matter. And now everybody's up watching his speeches on their TVs in their office, but you're not supposed to be hanging out in the Rose Garden. That day, the Colonnade was packed. Every staffer who could get out there for this historic moment was there. And I remember he gave this speech about, it feels like a thunderbolt, but then don't forget the decades of hard work that led up to this moment. And then we get on the helicopter and we go off to Charleston. And on the plane he said, I might sing. And Mrs. Obama and I kind of looked at him. Now, years later, he had said he was going to sing at a fundraiser in New York after Al Green had sung. And I'm backstage going, don't, it's not presidential. please don't do it. And of course, it breaks the internet. It's so popular because he's saying. So this time I'm like, if you want to sing, sing, sing. And of course, he does sing Amazing Grace, which brought not just everybody in that center together, but around the country. Just felt like a sense of oneness. Closing part of this story is 3 weeks before this, a young person on my staff who now works at the Obama Foundation came in my office, and the conversation went like this. And I had a pretty open door policy. And she told Kathy, I want to see Valerie. She comes in and she said, I have an idea. I'm not sure it's a good idea. I'm not even sure if it's a possible idea. It's actually not even my idea. It's an idea of somebody else, but they put me up to coming in here to say it, and I'm looking at it, I'm like this, get to the point, girl. What's your idea? You're on borrowed time here. So she said, what about if after marriage equality comes down and we win, we light the White House in a rainbow? And I said, that is a darn good idea, girl. I have no idea if it's possible. We figured out it was possible. Until that evening, I spent 3 hours on the north portico, right near the path where I had broken down in tears, watching the sun go down and the rainbow pop onto the White House. And it was, in the 8 years President Obama was in office, the single most requested photograph that we had of the White House.
Wow.
And after about 3 hours, late at night when there are thousands of people out in the park in front of the White House, Mrs. Obama and Malia snuck out of the White House. And you have to hear her tell the story about it's not easy to sneak out of the White House, even when you're the First Lady. And if you can imagine, she's heading to the door, and the Secret Service are like, they're moving to the door, I think. The front door, and then somebody stopped her and said, if you go out the front door, everybody is going to see you. So instead they came out the basement door and stood out on that portico as well. And she said she'd been watching it on TV, but she wanted Malia to see just this incredible moment of our nation's history. And what can happen is you can start to take those days for granted. And I do think that part of it is my age. I was old enough to know what an extraordinary experience it was to be able to spend all 8 years. I waved to the President and Mrs. Obama when they were leaving for the inauguration. I was still in the White House. And in fact, it got to the point where Secret Service was like, girl, you gotta go. You gotta go. It's like 10 minutes to 12.
Of all the stories that you probably could have told us, of all the things that happened during your time in the White House, it is not surprising that it would be a story about inclusivity. Because I think that says a lot about what you stand for and what you believe in and what you've been very passionate about throughout your entire career. So thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you.
So I have something to give you. So as you probably know, there is a tradition here at CTA where we give people bus stop signs that sort of tell their life story.
Oh my.
I have left CTA so many times, I have like 3 of them now. But we wanted to give you one in honor of your visit here. It's the number 12 Valerie Jarrett Express. We should have made the number 6, guys. You really blew it on that one. But,
That's good.
but it's for you to take with you. And
Thank you.
once again, thank you so much, Valerie, for being
Thank
a part
you all
of
very
this.
much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.